Okay. Welcome to the third of our candidates for our Chief Water Scientist for the Texas Water Resources Institute. Today we have Dr. Venkat Lakshmi from University of South Carolina, where he has been in the Department of Earth and Ocean Sciences for about 12 years. Prior to that, he came from Stanford University in the Geophysical Department and the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center. And so Venkat's seminar today is entitled Studies of the Land Surface Hydrologic Cycle Using Modeling, Observations, and Remote Sensing. Dr. Lakshmi.
Thank you so much, Neil. And thank you, everyone, for such a warm Texas welcome. The only thing not warm about the welcome is today's temperatures are thankfully a little low for somebody wearing a suit and not a polo shirt. So I'm happy to be here in Texas A&M, my first trip. I've been very impressed by whatever I have seen. And I'll be more impressed after the Aggie football season opens and you cut it out in the SEC, which I wish you the very best, except when you play South Carolina. So that's the title of my talk. And what I wanted to do is, rather than give just a 1 hour or 45-minute scientific talk, I split it up into two parts. And the first part is a seminar, as you would say in any research seminar, hydrological modeling for estimation of hydrological extremes. And it introduces a model, remote sensing, in situ observations, and discusses in great detail what I have published over the past 10 years in sets of different papers done with students. But the second part, I think, is very interesting. And this obviously would be of great interest to you because I'm trying to propound a vision for Texas A&M water research. And I know fully well there's already some mechanisms in place. And so whatever I say may be a little bit of a repeat, but at the same time shows what I understand of the situation or what I do not understand of the situation. So if you look out of an airplane window, and I'm sure this could be very well the picture outside College Station when you take off in one of those smaller planes, but this is actually Iowa, you see a landscape as such. So the science question which begs to be answered is, at any scale, the land surface is spatially heterogeneous. And I try to insist, at any scale. Soil, vegetation, and topography are some of the heterogeneities. They experience different forcing, precipitation, radiation, and winds. And as a result, they respond with hydrological variability, ecological variability, and biogeochemical variability. And all these quantities are very much in the realm of hydrological sciences or research in water. Now, stepping back from this, and that's very important, one of the major phenomenon of societal and scientific interests are extremes. And extremes have got a lot of attention in these days. A decade ago, coverage in newsprint or the web of extreme events, droughts, floods, tornadoes, hurricanes, was good. But today's coverage, I mean, you can go and read more than you can capture on these things. So there's a big societal and scientific interest on extremes. They're controlled by land surface hydrological response to weather and climate. But there comes the catch. It's extremely difficult to estimate hydrological extremes by a single method. So we have to combine hydrological modeling, remote sensing, and observations together to form the best and the complete picture. Very simply put, and trying to explain the water cycle to a group like this is like trying to preach to the choir. But very simply put, the hydrological cycle is no enigma. I mean, you can actually construct the hydrological cycle very accurately if you do a global average, if you do an annual average. It's very simple. It's very, very simple. As a rule of thumb, it rains 1 meter per year, global average. And it evaporates 1 meter a year, global average. I mean, average over many, many years, 100 years, for example. But when you start shrinking the cycle to smaller catchments, to smaller areas, and to event-based, it's very difficult. And I'll show you as such. So I'm going to start off with the first topic, hydrological modeling or estimation of extremes. So the model we used in hydrology is a model which has been used various times by the National Weather Service and the variants of this model are used in the Weather Service and called by different names. So this is not necessarily any one name model, though this is the variable infiltration capacity model. So in this model, we use 3 layers of the soil. The first layer, or layer 0, is 10 centimeters thick. The second layer is 30 centimeters thick, and the third layer is 100 centimeters thick. The surface is split into different tiles depending on homogeneous vegetation coverage. And you can see these are from 1 through n are different vegetation types. N plus 1 is the bare soil. And the different processes which occur in this grid box or in this column are evapotranspiration, evaporation from the canopy, evaporation from the bare soil, runoff, base flow, gravity flows or exchanges, infiltration, all driven by precipitation and resulting in a calculation of the water content of various layers. A very simple model, very simple accounting scheme. And it's even more simpler when you write a simple equation as such and you look at or follow the changes in soil moisture of the top layer. The Z is the thickness of the top layer times the volumetric water content. So that complete thing is a change in the soil moisture in millimeters for the top layer. Same thing in this for the second layer, and same thing in this for the third layer. And each of the layers have different input. A precipitation is obviously an input to the top layer. Runoff is an output. Evaporation is an output. The transpiration with the fraction of the roots in the top layer is one of the outputs. And the infiltration from the first layer to the second layer is an output. And that becomes the input to the second layer. And these are the outputs from the second layer. And you go on and so forth. Now, the beauty of vegetation, water balance at the land surface is that water and energy are coupled. And the incoming solar energy and the long wave radiation, subtract the outgoing long wave radiation, evapotranspiration, heating of the near surface atmosphere by the radiation, and the ground heating by or transmission of ground heat flux has to balance out to 0. You cannot create or destroy heat in the system. It has to balance out. And as a result, these systems of equations are coupled. It's fortunate and it's as well unfortunate. It's fortunate because you can see the connection between the bare soil evaporation and the transpiration in these fractions of the roots in the various layers. They all sum up to ET. On the other hand, you do not know the surface temperature, and surface temperature is easily calculated by solving this equation when you know ET. But the unfortunate part of this sets of equation is that you can't write a single analytical solution. These are a set of coupled differential equations, partial differential equations, but you cannot write a simple analytical solution unless you make a whole bunch of assumptions. So we maintain accurate account and conserve water and energy. There's a coherent connection between water and energy through latent heat and evaporation. And this is a system of nonlinear equations in soil moisture and surface temperature, because many of these quantities over here, unbeknownst to many of us, is a function of soil moisture. Surface runoff is a function of soil moisture. The evaporation is a function of soil moisture, etc. So it becomes a little complicated. As I said, if you make some assumptions, you can solve it analytically. But most people don't do that. So we did a simulation using this 3-layer hydrological model over a 50-year time period. We did a water balance and the energy balance. The time step of the water balance was daily. A spatial resolution of 1/8 of a degree, which translates to about 12.5 kilometers by 12.5 kilometers over the central United States. Energy balance was done hourly because, as we very well know, surface temperature and energy varies much fast, so you have to capture the diurnal variation. And the spatial resolution of the energy balance box was 1 degree by 1 degree, and I'll get to why I chose a bigger box because if you had computed over an hourly time step for the whole area, it would take forever to solve these equations. Our real estate for study is the upper Mississippi River Basin. It's about 443,000 square kilometers, and this shows you the DEM with the flow directions. You can see that's the outlet of the basin. River routing has to be done, and it was performed by using a linearized St. Venant equation with estimation of these two parameters, U, the velocity, and D, the diffusivity. Very, very simple stuff. Of course, in an offline model like this, we need to give it input. Some of the inputs come from the National Climate Data Center for rainfall and for temperature. And also, the rainfalls were all collected from a standard data set, so nothing all quality controlled. Soil and vegetation came from Penn State StatsGo data set, which is again used to calculate the various soil hydraulic properties. Vegetation data set came from University of Maryland, again, rooting depth, leaf area index, etc. So we ran this model and we said, is this model any good? And the traditional way of validation of a model are based on point estimates. And hydrologists over 200 years have been always comparing the output of a hydrological model with a stream gauge. And we did that. Grafton, Illinois, one of the outlets of this watershed. We simulated in this darker, in this light purple and measured in blue. And you can see, this is how it looks. This is monthly discharge. It is, we used calibration for those St. Venant equation parameters. And we had an R squared of 0.74 and a bias of about 32,000 cubic feet per second, 15% bias. Reasonably, it falls within the realm of all other studies for this basin. Nothing to brag about. Now, in this area, Illinois has a soil water survey. Illinois Soil Water Survey has a bunch of soil moisture sites, which they measure the soil moisture twice a month, between March and September, and once a month from October to February. And they measure it for the top 10 centimeters and then for 20 centimeter layer. So, we could aggregate it and compare for that particular box, that particular 1/8 degree box for the soil moisture from one site in Bonneville, Illinois. And then we have done this for all the sites in Illinois, I think 17 of them. And, we present the results out here. And again, no calibration has been done for these results. So these are as the model spit out the results. Okay? And you can see that we do reasonably well. Once you get to the aggregated, the whole soil moisture column, 0 to 1.4 meters, we do a little better because you're obviously lumping all the stuff together, so it does better. But that's not it, because that would be hydrology as we did 30 years ago. There's a spatial disconnect. Soil moisture is a point-based estimate. Stream flow is a point-based aggregator of all the distributed things which happen in a watershed. So things happen in the watershed in a distributed context, and in today's day and age, you want to compare that distributed output with respect to distributed data. And as a result, we said, neither of these capture the spatially distributed nature of the hydrological process in a catchment. So we used something which was available for 20 years, surface temperature, because in that equations of water and energy, I showed you the surface temperature calculated from the energy, which was linked to water. And so we compared surface temperature, and NASA has a series of sensors right from the 1980s which have captured surface temperature or mapped surface temperature globally, land and ocean, and they're very reliable, extremely reliable. So we started doing one of the years, and again, all of the results are published, and I'll share them with you. For January through December 1988, we do the monthly average satellite and the model and the difference. And the results are, the data were available from 1980 to 1999, 20 years of data. So the results are and again, this is segueing to my extremes section of this talk. 1988 was an extremely dry year in the Midwest, and you can see that the two estimates of surface temperature show similarities but also differences. There are certain months in which the spatial gradients, the north-south gradients, are different. And if you look at this result, and again, no tweaking, just a straight up presentation of the results, you can see that the surface temperature versus the model, you can see a certain amount of scatter, and then there are some points which are way out there which we do not know what happened, but you can see a good R squared out here. And this is actually one of the results published in a student whom I served on the thesis committee of, Josh Rhodes. Okay. Now, that's fine, but when I'm started to talk about extremes and I start to talk about droughts and floods, I don't just want to talk about rainfall or precipitation, but I want to talk about soil moisture, because at the end of the day, the plant feels lack of soil, and that's why it doesn't grow. So if I start looking at soil moisture, and I start looking at the different layers, and I compare 2 years, 1988 and 1993. 1988 was one of the driest summers on record in the Midwest. And it was the summer where it was so hot that I used to go out running. That was the first summer I was in the United States. And I used to go out running at midnight because that was the only time it was cool enough to run. And 1993 was that time of the great Midwestern flood, which we all remember. So I said, let's contrast these two. I start off with the top layer. I start off with the top layer. The top layer, again, you remember, is 10 centimeters thick. 10 centimeters thick translates to 100 millimeters. And 100 millimeters with, let's say, 0.5 porosity is 50 millimeters of water, which it can hold. So the drought year in July, and then July was the peak of the drought. And so was July the peak of the flood. 22.1 millimeters of water is held as an average over the basin in 88. Now 87 and 89 were no drought or no flood or nothing. I mean, it's normal years. 24, 23. So you can see this 22 is very much within the level of the other years. Now if you go to the flood year, 1993, 26.1 millimeters of water is held in 1993 as opposed to 25.3 in 1992 and 24.3 in 1994. So if you compare it, in 1993, layer 1 held 4% more water than 1992 and 1994. In 1988, the drought year, layer 1 held 8% soil water less than the other years. Just comparing. Because again, you want to see what the soil moisture is with the drought and the flood. Now you go to the second layer. Remember, the second layer was 30 centimeters thick. And it extends from 10 centimeters to 40 centimeters. And again, 30 centimeters is 300 millimeters. So at most, it can hold 150 millimeters of water. That's if it is soaking wet. In the drought year, you're holding 58 millimeters of water. Remember, you can hold up to 150. And in the flood years, or in the non-drought years, you're holding 73, 69. And in the flood year, 81 versus 77 and 75. So I'm just comparing. And again, these are all data from the model, or all outputs from the model. So in the drought year, the second layer held 20% less water than in the two adjacent years. And in the flood year, layer 2 held 5% more water than 1992 and 1994. It still doesn't give me a warm, fuzzy feeling. So I go to the third layer. In the third layer, which is a meter thick, it can hold as much as half a meter of water, 500 millimeters. In the drought year, I hold 184 millimeters of water, and the two adjacent years is 253 and 240. That's 28% less. And again, magnitudes are important, but when you're comparing things of different ranges, you have to compare percentages. And you can see over here that it's 28% less in the drought year. And if you go to the flood year, 375 compared to 284 and 310, 30% more water. So what does this tell us? You compare July 1988 and July 1993. For the third layer, there is a doubling of soil water holding in the deep layer. And this is where many of the trees have their roots, 40 centimeters below the soil. And you can see, and this was again something published in a book edited by Vijay Singh and Don Fervert. Now, that is just an observation. But what's more interesting is that if you look at the drought year and the flood year, and these are the soil moisture traces over the year, okay? The top part is the wet year, 1988, and the bottom part is the drought year or the flood year of 1993, and the bottom part is the flood year or drought year or 1988. You can see that the propagation of the signal when the peak starts in the wet year, and this is the blue line because I use blue for wet and red for dry. You can see the propagation, the first dry peak is around 180, here about 180 day, and then it progresses to about 250. So the drought propagates from the surface to the deep layer. And same thing with the flood. It propagates from the about day 100 to about day 200. But even more interesting than that is a result which shows that in the wet year, it starts off being wet. So initially wet spring results in more rainfall results in more wetter conditions. And a little bit drier than normal spring or winter, and then no rainfall results in deepening of the drought. And this is also seen from the flood picture, and this flood picture was very popular. I think the White House used it a lot to show people what happened with respect to the flood. And this was another paper published by a summer student of mine in TWRI. You can see, look at that big blob of wetness. And you can see that blob of wetness, then slowly dissipates. That's the wetness. Okay, so it's easy to see that the rainfall associated wetness translates slowly and trickles through the system, creating the flood. Or the dryness slowly propagates through the system, drying out layers progressively and time lagged. And the best part of this is that we did not use any groundwater in the modeling because our model was only 1.4 meters thick. Most of the places the groundwater is deeper. But if you compare the Illinois Soil Water Survey and the groundwater relative to the deepest value, this is independent analysis by Sonia Seneviratne and her colleagues in Switzerland. They found that there was a strong connection between the soil water survey data from Illinois and the groundwater data. So obviously, even if I don't go and try to model the groundwater at every location in the watershed, if I just do my deep layer, I get enough of understanding that the groundwater has also dried up. And doing some time series analysis of this, and we published this in GRL, it shows that the best indicator of the drought is not just the rainfall or Palmer Drought Severity Index, but our soil moisture. And our soil moisture actually, right here, this is the best one, the autocorrelation. It confirms that soil moisture is a better predictor during droughts for future monthly temperatures. And that's where, and again, all over the world, you don't find deep soil moistures. You can't. I mean, you can't have enough sensors to capture the soil moisture in the deep layers because it's simply not possible, not feasible to maintain such expensive networks. Now, Oklahoma and Illinois are two places where there have been extensive surveys, and Oklahoma Mesonet is a good place where you can find soil moisture data, but it's difficult. And once you go past United States, as I will share in the second part of my talk, you don't have much observing systems. So you have to depend on modeling. And modeling soil moisture and looking at its autocorrelation and between various variables shows very strongly that your third layer soil moisture and your coherence with respect to runoff is very strong. So modeling deep soil moisture is a path forward to understanding the propagation of wet season and for droughts. So obviously, this was a study published in a few papers, 4 or 5 papers, and worked on by many students, and over the past 10 years, we learn a lot from macro scale hydrological modeling. And this is a focus of study still, because we still have extremes of floods and droughts. So use of hydrological model yields information on variability of subsurface soil moisture that is not routinely observed. Okay. The spatially distributed variability of soil moisture reflects vegetation, land cover, soil type, and precipitation. In periods of flooding and droughts, the deep layer, by virtue of its inertia, displays the largest change in soil moisture, and it also takes time. It doesn't happen immediately. Spatial variability of model soil temperature shows spatial and seasonal variability. It is seen that the deep layer soil moisture reflects the changes in the groundwater table, or vice versa. Okay. The deep layer soil moisture is also an indicator of floods and droughts and shows good predictive power and has much better physical meanings than indices like PDSI, which is just a fact formula to calculate. So it just shows you that using modeling is a good path forward for prediction or propagation of hydrological extremes. So obviously, try to segue to the second part and talk about research at Texas A&M. I pose these questions. The pertinent societal and scientific questions arise from this and hydrological water resource research are: how much water, quantity of water, or level of contamination or changes in quality can we expect in the next 20 years, 50 years, and 100 years? And again, I'm trying to say that it's not just amount of water, but you can go even one more step further and say how much water per person. And that's a very interesting question in itself. Then, how can we estimate the acceleration of the water cycle due to climate change? There have been a lot of papers and a lot of work on acceleration of the water cycle. It just means that the residence time of water in the atmosphere is changing. We all learned in our textbook it was 9 days, but it's definitely shrinking. So what is the impact of that on agriculture? What is the impact of that on ecology? So to segue to using those questions and the background of this research talk, I'll start off with talking about what I think about water research here. Now, global fresh water is important, and obviously this is one of the many examples why it is important. In 2006, the cover of Science and a whole section on science was devoted on estimate freshwater resources. And this is the first time, actually, Science normally publishes, things which are a little bit more, if I may use the word sciencey, more biotechnology or, the good stuff, but, not water. Nobody thinks about water as that, that cutting edge science. But science is now very much into this. And so that was the first time when, I really saw, it's not just us, but it's the broader community of concerned scientists who feel very strongly about it. And, you can get these maps by the wazoo, but I wanted to go with one which had that United Nations Environment Program seal on it. So it's a little dated, so it's about 10, 12 years ago. But you can see that these are things where people publish it. Again, you can publish this every minute if you wanted to. All you need is some data. But this one was particularly alarming. And again, in 2000, you could see that vast portions of Africa, Central, Middle East, Europe actually, South Asia, they're all under severe water stress. And then like exposure to risk, like radiation, for example, or exposure to, ozone or whatever, ultraviolet light. So exposure to caused by perturbation and stresses, and that could be lack of water. And in a coupled system, you're not looking just at the scientific aspects of it, like biophysical controls, but there's socioeconomic conditions. And this becomes very important when you start looking at societies which depend a lot on agriculture and farming and settlements where agriculture becomes a big part of the socioeconomic parts. And then you have a system response, adjustment and adaptations, risks and impact. And if you broadly look at a system going through a drought or a flood washing off crops, exposure to the risk, sensitivity. And again, the sensitivity is something you can calculate. I mean, you can actually, very simply, if you have the data, you can say how much does 1 inch less rainfall per year affect the productivity of soybeans in South Carolina. You can do that. You can do a delta. Change in rainfall divided by, or a change in production of soybeans divided by change in rainfall. It's very simple. That's sensitivity. And we do sensitivity all the time. But here, socioeconomic, you can say, how much does 1 inch less of rainfall affect the economic output from soybean farmers in South Carolina? You can do that. People have done that. And then comes the part where actually social conditions becomes a little more difficult, because we go from exact numbers to a little bit more psychology and sociological networks, resilience. And so these all are connected. And obviously, if you see that a coupled system, variability and change in human conditions, environmental variability and change, and then if you go even farther, then you start looking at relating the scientific part of the biosphere to changes in politics and economy, and that all goes and feeds back to this coupled system, because this coupled system is not just hydrology or agriculture, which are simple. You can do this calculations on your computer, but it's changes in socio-economic conditions which change the politics and the landscape. May it be insurance, may it be some kind of money destined to rescue farmers. And so that becomes a whole bunch more complicated problem. A whole bunch more complicated problem than just saying, oh, we had less rainfall this year, so we are in a drought, or we had too much rainfall, so we are doing okay. So it becomes a coupled system. And I'll come back to talking about this in a minute. So obviously, since we are in Texas and we are talking about water and sometimes, most of the time now, lack of water, the one thing you have to have in such a system is observing. And it can be in many ways. And again, I do think that if you had a groundwater monitoring well every 100 yards, you could map everything very nicely and it would be perfect. But we don't have that. We can't do that. So we also always have to use science and models. But this chart gives you a little bit of an example on, you want to monitor lakes, you want to have gauges on rivers, and there are gauges on. You have flux towers, and there are networks of flux towers in Texas. You radiosondes releasing balloons into atmosphere to figure out the profile. Satellites, which can give you a good bird's eye view of what's going on, and that could be precipitation, it could be soil moisture. Satellites can also detect changes in vegetation, etc. And then, of course, for rainfall, we have very, very good data sets. And I think probably the biggest innovations in the last 20 years have been this advent of Doppler radars, where you can predict moving thunderstorms because you follow it. And for subsurface, something which is coming really now online and becoming very popular is geophysical data, trying to map the subsurface strata to see how much water, or what are the kinds of layers. Forget even how much water. What's there out there? And this is a vast unknown. So you observe all this, but in the end, as I said, that you cannot learn everything by observations alone, because observations alone are sparse and intermittent. So what you do is you have to construct an integrated Earth water model. And you can construct it from available data, model analysis, etc. And basically your slice going from subsurface to the growth layer, and that's the part I explained a little bit in my first part of the talk, the biosphere. It's a very important part because vegetation plays a central role in the water cycle. and then atmosphere. So basically, if you think about this as a layered cake, you want to make sure you know what's in each of the layers before eating it. That's the whole point. And this layer, you can construct yourself. I mean, you can find data sets for this, for this, for this, and this, and stack them up in a way that can answer your questions. But stacking it up only makes sense if you are trying to understand the process. And the process, when I always talk about process, I think about storage and flux. One, you store water or water-related items in your layers. And two is the flux, exchange. Because the fluxes determine how much storage it adds to the storage or subtracts from the storage, or how much the changes, the amount of storage determine how much fluxes occur. It's a two-way. So you can see, groundwater storage, groundwater flow, soil moisture, and other things associated with that, which we saw in the seminar. And then vegetation has transpiration, photosynthesis, nutrient exchange, all the carbon, biogeochemical cycle, and atmosphere, the storage and fluxes affect both rainfall, advection, precipitation. Now, all of that is fine, but just dealing with these artificial slices will not give hydrologists or people working on a landscape any understanding of what's happening, unless you then go back and say, what's happening in a watershed? And the beauty of the watershed, it's an integrator. So whatever comes in here as your inputs or changing inputs, you can change your vegetation with time. Your soils probably don't change on the time scales we're talking about, neither does topography, but wind, radiation, and precipitation can change. So the watershed is like a filter, if you think in mathematical terms. It filters out things and rearranges its quantities. And in that context, human intervention of management practices, agriculture, whatever, land use, plays a big role in this. And so if you look at this filter and look at what comes out of it, that's where your observing system, which I just talked about, lies. Now coming to Texas A&M, and I call this chart the planetary system of Texas A&M. And again, I will take any blame for any mistakes in this chart. We all know water is important. All of us know water is important, and I put that as the center of the universe. But the most important part which Texas A&M has, I call as the 3 E's, fashioned after the 3 R's. Ecology, economics, and extension. And if you think about these 3 E's, you really can't go outside that. I mean, everything else falls under ecology. Hydrology is an ecological science, to some extent. Okay? Because without hydrology, you can't do ecology. Without movement of water, you can't tell how much nutrients moved in the subsurface, because water is the thing which moves it. So this trifecta is the part which is the most important. And the aspects what water affects, animal, vegetation, human, well, that's all parts of science. And you have all these sciences, climate and weather are obviously dictated by water movement, and also they dictate water movement. And wildlife and soil science, agricultural sciences, they all depend on water. So if you think about this part over here, and again, I may come back to this again. And then if you think about that vulnerability chart I presented, ecology forms the biospheric functions. Economics are that socioeconomic part, the economic part of the socioeconomic balance. And extension becomes that human component, because it's a feedback. Without the feedback, you're not going to get anything happening. So if you come to think about what kind of questions you can ask, and again, obviously anything the chief water scientist will do has to be bottom up. I can't say, oh, let's work on this project. Maybe a little bit, but have to learn to listen to the constituents of this system to come up with questions. But I do have some ideas of some questions. And one of the questions is how people and their associated watersheds respond to drought and temperature change associated with anthropogenic part of climate change, with the object of identifying which human environment systems are most vulnerable to negative impacts. So I've been reading a lot about the Texas drought, and I saw a lot of articles saying that there are certain birds which used to fly through here, and they stopped coming because there was no water. I mean, there's a lot of impact which I don't think comes out in popular literature because it's more difficult observationally, and it becomes a much bigger problem than just hydrology or constructing that model and running it on the computer. Second, how does changes in policies that affect the pricing of water in combination with changes in water quality and quantity due to global environmental changes influence human environment system, and what kind of systems are most vulnerable to negative impacts? And you can see that last part of the questions are same. Because in most of the world, there is no price on water. I mean, you drill a well in your backyard, you pump it out, you don't pay anything for it. But if you go to the gas station and pump gas into your car, you have to pay for it. So if you think about it, this is a big logical question of how do you think about pricing, and that comes back to economics. So there are two challenges to this position, not just to me, but to this position. What will be the relation of this position, the internal challenge, means within this framework? What will be the relation of this position in the context of Texas Water Resource Institute and Texas A&M? So how best can TWRI provide that two-way collaboration? In my meetings with people over the last day, I have learned so many things about water activities which I could not have learned from reading the websites, because I can't know how many meetings are held or how many thesis defenses are held. So obviously there's a lot of stuff going on. So how best can a chief water scientist or this position help to facilitate this? That's the internal challenge. So now the external challenge is that, okay, you facilitate people to get together, but people will not stay together if the bonds of money don't come in. They say blood is thicker than water. I think money is thicker than water. I mean, you want people to share money. When you share money, you're close friends. And so for that, you have to decide how much research work we can do in Texas and how much research work we can do US-wide, because the drought problems of Texas a little different than what you could expect in Georgia, but different soils, little bit different climate, little different climatology. But to some extent, you can map some similarities. And then how about global? How can you harness the power of foundations, or is there a balance between foundations and peer-reviewed grants? And of course, in these days with disappearing appropriations, disappearing pork money, you have to depend on writing proposals. So if you add all of this together, and I took a stab at this thing, you have a lot of science in here. Geomorphology, rainfall, infiltration, subsurface, and then you want to integrate data. And I know that there's a very strong GIS group who knows how to pull things together. And then surface deformation because of groundwater withdrawals. Then you have wildlife, fisheries, agriculture, crop, and it's all bound by economics, sociology. So it's a diversity. It's really a diversity, but it has a lot of connections. And to see this connection some other way, it's like you have this big umbrella of Texas Water Resource Institute. It's a huge thing. It's land-grant university with a big institute. But you have many sciences, and we're all one of these. I may be just doing hydrology here, and somebody may be just doing agriculture economics here, and somebody may be just doing ecology here. So it's all these connections which some of it already exists. So nobody has to reinvent the wheel. But at the same time, there are some ways to put this all into a framework, so some kind of coherency is maintained and established and maintained. So that's what I call as water sciences at Texas A&M. Ability to answer cross-cutting interdisciplinary questions relating to water. Not just water, but interdisciplinary questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have several minutes for questions.
I think I may have put everybody to sleep.
No, not at all. Not at all. So, our Water Resources Institute has a relationship with USGS.
Of course.
And so, have you worked with USGS, and how do you think we can begin to embed ourselves into that federal agency a little closer, so that we begin to have their issues be our issues and become less responsible?
You know, I have very close ties with the USGS district office in Columbia, South Carolina. It's a water office. It's just a water spot, and they're all. It's a very different model than many other agencies. That USGS office is all based on soft money, so they go and write proposals and contracts. And I mean, I don't think we compete directly, but we do get together many times to discuss collaborations and serve on common committees. So at the local level, I mean, I do not know how the USGS office, the local office in College Station is structured, but you know, I have had experience writing proposals with my local USGS office, and they like it when we have collaborations. Now, you can do collaborations in many ways. Now, if somebody is already on 100% time, they can volunteer their time pro bono as as a collaborator with no cost, and that builds up that component. And I think USGS is very good because they are facing more and more problems in their funding, and to show that they are connected deeply with academia and with state organizations makes it very strong. And again, you know, one of their central missions is water. So I think there is an ample amount of collaborations with USGS on that matter. And they do have internal funding they compete for. So, you know, there is a part where we could all actually go in and get some money in collaboration with them. And I think, you know, that is a very wise move to do.
Dr. Lakshmi, you talked about Texas A&M and the institute and its several components.
Mm-hmm.
Texas A&M has a system.
Yes.
And it's got its own other things that come under that,
Mm-hmm.
the agri-life research and the engineering side of things.
Mm-hmm.
And they're scattered all over the state.
Yeah.
And under the purview of a water program, how do you foresee that cohesion that we need?
Mm-hmm. I think when I meant Texas A&M, and that's why I said that, I think truly the interview has been an educational experience, because I did not know how big the tentacles were, you know, before I came here. And I think creating cohesion, it's not easy, as people pointed out. You know, there's hundreds of meetings every week. Why do you want to add another meeting? So obviously we do not want to add another meeting. We have to bring people together to collaborate on big ideas. And big ideas can be two ways. One is reactive. You know, you have a big call of proposals from, you know, whatever, NOAA or USGS or NSF. So we have to be ready to have that team go green and try to start writing a proposal. So I think it's important to establish some kind of network. I mean, maybe virtual, you know, on the computer, obviously, and have a monthly, you know, web-based conferences or calls, and short calls to keep in touch. And this way, we can share with each other what kind of opportunities are arising. Because if we make it a point that, oh, this office will figure out opportunities and tell people, that's a one-way interaction. But I think I think that this position should work bottom up as much as top down. And so if we establish a kind of network where somebody hears about some opportunity or somebody thinks of some need, then not only can we be reactive to writing a proposal, but we can be proactive and say, look, we want to do we want to do this study together. And in the end of the day, the only thing which brings people together is collaborations and money. We can have all the meetings in the world we want, but as the time goes on, people will have more pressing needs, and they will stop attending these meetings, virtual or otherwise. And so I think the need needs to come to establish a few big projects successfully funded, so then after that we can go and say, oh yeah, we are a big network and we can do that. And that, obviously what you said is true. It extends to the Texas AgriLife extension services all over the state, as well as the whole Texas A&M University system, not just College Station. I completely concur.
So what's your experience in doing that?
That's a good question. So I have not worked in ag. I've never, we are not the land grant university in South Carolina. Our neighbor school, Clemson, is. So my experience in doing this on a larger scale stems from working with the American Geophysical Union. And I have brought people together on several occasions. The two occasions I can name very distinctly are, I edited a book about 10 years ago based on a series of special sessions I put together at the AGU fall meeting. And I brought people together to write different chapters of the book and successfully published it. And this February I organized an AGU Chapman meeting on remote sensing of the terrestrial water cycle, and a book proposal is out to AGU. So we'll have about 70 chapters of the book. So bringing people together to contribute is something I do, and hopefully I can use those organizing powers to bring people together. And again, I have not done anything like this before, so it will be a first.
Anything else? Okay, well, we've got about actually time for one more question, if there are any, or just anything that you want to leave us with. We've got just a few minutes before we need to be upstairs. So.
Thank you very much for attending, and as I said, thank you very much for this warm welcome, and best wishes to all of you and to the Aggieland nation for your SEC premiere of the SEC football. I'm a big football fan, so you have to realize that. My whole, starting on Thursday evening, it's